over to you, Maria, for what sounds like a very interesting topic and very relevant to COVID-19 and people's responses to it. Over to you, and you're welcome to share your screen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so let me just quickly share my screen. Can everyone see it well?
Yeah,
okay,
perfect.
Thanks. So, all right, so today I just want to kind of share with you this paper that I've been working with together with Robert Durr from Rotterdam and with Stefan Meyer from Columbia University. And this is a paper about how attitudes towards immigrants are shaped, and in particular in the context of growing up during recessions, during bad business cycles, and so on and so forth. And the motivation for this paper actually comes from a growing literature. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but there's an increasing interest in how this macroeconomic condition during people's impressionable years impact people's attitudes and preferences. And if you're not familiar with this impressionable years literature, the idea there is that the period between 18 and 25 is very formative, and whatever experiences you're going to have during those years, they're going to have long-lasting effects on people's attitudes and preferences and beliefs. And so there is quite a lot of support for the idea that when people grow up in a recession, they show an increase in compassion, an increase in other regarding preferences and altruism. In particular, like here, the seminal very important papers, Giuliano and Spellenberger, which also quite relevant to our discussion earlier, they look at what happens when people in the US grow up during a recession, and they show that they tend to have stronger preferences for redistribution, and they're more likely to vote for the Democratic Party, which historically has also been associated with an increased support for redistribution. And a little bit more on the psychologist side, Emily Bianchi has a couple of papers which shows, in a similar vein, that if you grow up in a recession, people tend to be less narcissistic and less individualistic. So there is a growing literature on that. On the other hand, we also have a little bit of a contribution to this literature. And in a recent paper, we show that those people who grow up in a recession tend to prefer, or when you ask them to rank job preferences, they seem to rank income much higher than they rank meaning in their job, right? Meaning here being quite broadly defined, but you can also think of it of things doing work which is useful and valuable for society, right? And these things are a little bit at odds, like our findings with the rest of the literature. So in this paper, we're essentially trying to ask if what the previous literature finds is really an universal increase in compassion, or is it more a parochial kind of phenomenon, which does not necessarily apply to groups like immigrants. And the reason that we're particularly interested in immigrants here is because there are a number of theories showing how current business cycles or current macroeconomic conditions affect attitudes towards immigration. And here, the most intuitive idea is that, there's labor market competition theories which show that, when people compete for jobs, when jobs are scarce, or when they have to compete for government transfer, this is going to have a negative impact on their attitudes towards immigration, right? And the idea here, of course, being that, as I said, recession tends to intensify competition, and these findings appear to be particularly pronounced for unskilled workers in richer countries, right? And this is quite intuitive because they are the group who is most likely to have to compete with these immigrants, right? As opposed to, for example, high-skilled workers, right? Which might be in higher demand. And in a very similar vein, there is also some evidence that competition tends to increase in-group bias, right? So again, when jobs are scarce, where people have to compete for a limited set of resources, this tends to intensify out-group hostility. Right, so how do we reconcile these things? Where essentially what we're trying to answer in this paper is how does experiencing different macroeconomic conditions during impressionable years is going to shape attitudes towards immigration? And how persistent will these changes in attitudes be? So empirically, we're going to first look at the United States because this is an interesting example of a rich developed country which also kind of experiences a relatively steady flow of immigration. And after that, we're going to see, okay, is the United States a special case, or is this something that we see globally in both developed and developing economies? So we're going to start with the General Social Survey. And I guess most people are familiar with it. This is a repeated representative cross-section in the US. And we're particularly going to focus on this question, which asks respondents, do you think that the number of immigrants coming to America nowadays should be either increased or reduced? Right, and this is going to essentially be our proxy for anti-immigration attitudes. And we have this question in 10 different waves in relatively recent history, right? So from 1994 to 2016. So let me just be really kind of straightforward about this. So this is a rather descriptive paper. We're not really claiming that we're finding any kind of causal effect here, but essentially we're trying to see how much of the variation in this anti-immigration attitudes can really be explained by macroeconomic conditions that people experience during their impressionable years, right? But to move a little bit more in the direction of causality, we're going to use regional variation in these macroeconomic conditions, right? And this is helping us to, in a sense, control for this time variant common shocks, which are usually very problematic in these types of settings. So let me just walk you through our kind of main specification and empirical approach. And if somehow something is not clear, please do jump in and ask me. So as I said, our left-hand side variable is this anti-immigration attitudes question, and we're trying to explain variation here by our main explanatory variable, which is going to be the logarithm of the real income per capita during somebody's impressionable years, right? And this individual I is going to be, so we're going to look at the real income per capita that individual I living in region R during their impressionable years experienced, right? And living here in the general social survey, we don't know exactly where people live every year, but we do know where people live at the age of 16. So we're trying to use this as a proxy for the region in which they live during their impressionable years. Now, here we also control for a very large set of demographics, which is quite nice usually in the general social survey, and also for year fixed effects and region fixed effects, right? And we control for region fixed effects, both for the region where you live at the age of 16 and the region in which you're living at the time of the survey, right? So essentially, this is our empirical approach. So let me just show you first what we find are our main results, right? So in the first column, we're essentially estimating exactly the equation that I showed you on the previous slide, where we control for a large number of demographics. And we find that, you know, a doubling of experienced income during your impressionable years is going to make people significantly less anti-immigration, right? So this is a 5-point scale variable, and this is nearly half a point on a 5-point scale. So this is not only statistically significant, but it is also economically significant, because if you look at the distribution of these experiences over time, there is substantial variation both across regions and over time. Now, in the second column, what I wanted to show you is how persistent this effect is, right? So essentially, if we're going to interact our income level variable with different age groups, you can see that, so the baseline coefficient here is going to be the effect for those who are currently in their impressionable years. And I think that what's quite interesting here, and it has important kind of socio-political implications, is that not only that a doubling of experienced income is going to affect those in their impressionable years, but we see virtually no decay over the lifetime, right? So over the life cycle. So essentially, if you're going to grow up in a recession and you're going to become more anti-immigration, you will persist with this belief, with these attitudes until the rest of your life, independent or on top of the current macroeconomic conditions, right? Or the current business cycle. And, you know, I also mentioned in the beginning that there could be substantial heterogeneity in which people are particularly affected by these macroeconomic shocks and how their beliefs are going to change, right? And the previous literature argues that we should expect to see this particularly pronounced for those low-skilled workers in rich countries who are most likely to compete with other immigrants, especially with low-skilled immigrants. And so a natural way to test this is to look whether there are heterogeneous effects by the level of education. So in the GSS here, we split our sample both by your own level of education or by the education of your father. And so what we find is very much in line with this idea, right? It is particularly those who are low educated who respond very strongly to this negative shocks during the impressionable years, right? And this is consistent both for your own level of education, but also if your parents or if your father was low educated. And I think what's interesting here is that, you know, the high educated people respond too, and they respond in the same way, but to a much less extent. They are far less susceptible, it seems, to this mechanism. So just to kind of sum up what I showed you so far, it seems that experiencing high regional income during impressionable years is going to make people more in favor of immigration. And we do find that the lower skilled workers are particularly affected by this. And this is controlling for their current income and for their labor market status, right? So this mechanism goes on top of those controls. Now, is the United States a special case, or is this something that we see persistently in other countries as well? So now we turn to the World Value Survey, which has data on about 100 different countries, both developed and developing. And here we have two different questions. We have one question which we call immigration restriction. And here the question is, should the government restrict people from other countries from coming here to work? And the second question, which we call native priority, is should employers give priority to people from this nation over immigrants when jobs are scarce? So in a way, this is the same flavor with the question that we have in the GSS, but these are even stronger linked to the labor market directly, right? Because it is about work, it is about jobs priorities. And our identification strategy is exactly the same, but here, instead of looking at different regions in the US, we looked at different countries. And so our income level during impressionable years is calculated by using the Madison and Ball data set, who have this data for about 100 countries going over 100 years back. So let me just again show you what we find in the World Value Survey. Right? So remember that these are 100 different countries. What we do find is that the results are very much in line with what we see in the GSS. Right? So people who experience the doubling of income during impressionable years are less likely to be anti-immigration, and they're less likely to say that the government should prioritize jobs when they're scarce. And again, very much in line with what I showed you earlier, this effect is extremely persistent. So we see virtually no decay up to the age of 75. Now, what's interesting here is that we can look at both developed and developing countries and see what is the heterogeneity there. Is this happening especially from European, OECD developed countries, or do we also see this in developing economies? So in the first column, I split the sample by those OECD nations, while in the second column, we have the remaining countries in the world, mostly developing and emerging economies. And what I think is interesting here is that the effect is robust. The effect is there in poorer countries as well, but it is particularly large in these rich countries. It's nearly twice larger than in the poorer countries. So it does appear that these recessions during impressionable years affect people particularly in developed countries. And to just go even one step further, can we disaggregate even further and see whether it is the high skilled or the low skilled in these different countries, right? So what we see, so here we have the low educated people in rich countries compared to the low educated people in the rest of the world. And here we have the high educated in rich countries compared to the high educated in the rest of the world. And so I would say that the main takeaway here is that low skilled people are far more responsive to these shocks. And this is true comparatively in both rich and developing countries. And we find relatively similar results for the other measure as well. Well, we can come back to it. But I wanted to just summarize and show you a little bit more about in-group bias and in-group mentality. So I think so far what we find is that growing up in better macroeconomic conditions is going to lower anti-immigration attitudes. This is similar to what we see in the GSS. It's particularly pronounced in rich economies, and it is stronger for low-skilled workers in both rich and developing economies. So how do we square this up with these previous findings showing that growing up in a recession makes people more other-regarding, it makes people more compassionate and more altruistic? So what's quite handy here is that we can offer some descriptive evidence by looking at a couple of other questions in the World Value Survey. So they have this nice question where they ask respondents to name groups of people that you would not like as your neighbors. And so there we look at people from a different race, people from a different religion, and immigrants or foreign workers. And what's nice here is that, well, you know, you could make an argument that being anti-immigration is not necessarily out-group hostility argument, right? There could be economic reasonable arguments why somebody could be anti-immigration. But I think this argument is a lot weaker when you're talking about people from a different race or from a different religion who have been living in that country for a long time. And what we show here is that indeed the results are persistent across these different groups of people, right? So a doubling of income during impressionable years would make people less positive towards immigrants, but also less positive towards people of a different race or towards people of a different religion, right? And again, this does appear to be predominantly driven by these rich countries. The effects are also there in developing countries. They are significant, but they are about half the size of what we see in these developing countries, in these rich countries, sorry. So let me just kind of sum up what we think the main takeaway from this paper should be, and then really I would be very interested in whatever comments or feedback you have. So we think that growing up in bad macroeconomic conditions negatively affects attitudes towards immigration, and it is interesting that these effects seem to persist for life. So there are potentially long-term consequences to recessions that we are not thinking about very carefully yet. And I do think that our results are not necessarily inconsistent with the previous literature on, for example, altruism or compassion, but it does indicate that support for redistribution policies is not so much out of an increase in universal altruism or into solidarity, but it can be seen more of an increase into self-interest, right? So in a way, you can think that redistribution and immigration attitudes are interconnected, right? So if you grow up in a recession, it is perfectly, you know, you can imagine a story where you are more pro-redistribution, right? Because you grew up in these bad times, but this desire for a distribution does not reflect in your attitudes towards immigration because you are more competitive with this group. So we think that this provides some evidence that these bad macroeconomic shocks will affect in-group bias and potentially indicates that it could be quite difficult to foster tolerance in this difficult macroeconomic times.